They were referred to as female eunuchs, and the sound of 3,000 of them dying reverberated throughout the prohibited back city in April of 1421. A clean blade did not execute this quickly. Hour after hour, bamboo rods were used in a slow, deliberate annihilation. The courtyard stones were so covered in blood by sunset that architects would subsequently suggest replacing them. However, the massacre itself wasn't the most terrifying aspect, it was the quiet that ensued. Imperial historians got to work right away, not just documenting the tragedy but also wiping it from history, as if they had never existed. The names and lives of a whole generation of palace women vanished. However, mass killings of this magnitude are never arbitrary. It is a sign of a serious illness that is afflicting an empire. What, then, might have occurred within the Forbidden City to incite such a monumental slaughter? What gave these women the nickname female eunuchs, and what was so secret that an emperor would kill almost 3,000 women and then obliterate their memories in order to keep it hidden? When 13-year-old girls first heard the recruitment drums reverberating through their communities, we must go back in time to see how mass murder became palace custom. Village streets reverberated with the sound of the drums. Mothers held their 13-year-old daughters tightly on recruitment day, knowing that they might not see them again. This roar rolled like thunder across China every 3 years. The palace machine needed new bodies for imperial agents. At its height, it employed 22,000 people, the great majority of whom were women and girls. The math was straightforward and harsh. Choose 5,000 girls from all throughout the empire. 4,700 should be eliminated in tiered trials. So 300 most perfectly fractured should be kept. Chen was one of 1,000 girls, all between the ages of 13 and 15. Who were standing in a line in the spring of 1407. The eunuch who was being chosen passed by, his silk shoes hardly making a sound as they touched the stone. At every 10th girl he stopped to examine the shapes of her face, measure the width of her shoulders with painted wooden rods, and examine her teeth like livestock at the market. The sound of sobbing filled the courtyard, but it came from the moms crowded against the gates outside, not the girls who had been told that crying would result in immediate rejection. In Chun's group, 700 girls were eliminated in the first cut, either too tall, too short, too attractive, or not attractive enough. The agents had standards to uphold but quotas to meet. Even seasoned slavers would be shocked by the selection. Criteria for palace maids, which included being invisible, plain enough to avoid tempting the royals, and attractive enough to avoid offending them. Girls were forced to stand in closed rooms for hours in order to test for body odor. They made them recite poems till their throats roared in order to test their vocals. They studied hands, feet, and even the breathing patterns of sleeping girls. It was worse in the second round. Tests of intelligence intended to fail the majority of applicants. Memory tests in which girls were asked to repeat difficult directions after hearing them just once. Physical endurance tasks include hauling water jugs up an unending flight of stairs, standing still for 6 hours, and holding uncomfortable positions until muscles ached. Chen watched as one female after another passed out and was pulled away by guards. One of the most sinister mysteries in history is what became of the 4,700 rejections. According to some reports, they were sold to a brothel. Others asserted that they were merely returned to families that didn't want girls who had been tarnished by royal rejection. One fact stayed the same, even though the truth probably differed by place and decade. Social death was the result of rejection. Chen started with 1,000 girls, but after the third day, there were only 300 left. They had established their endurance, survived the cuts, and displayed the ideal ratio of skill to deference. They were proclaimed selected for imperial glory by palace officials. The 300 victors were completely unaware that they had lost everything. They were put onto covered wagons that evening. Families who were informed that emotion would interfere with the girls' preparation for palace duty were not permitted to say goodbye. As the cartwheels rolled, Chen could hear her mother's cries, becoming less loud. There were 299 other girls sitting in the dark around her, some of them praying, some of them having already learned the first lesson of life in a palace. Survival meant silence. It takes weeks to travel to the capital. They were reminded of their luck by handlers at every stop. Their food would be superior than that of their relatives. They would witness wonders that the village could not imagine. The Son of Heaven himself had been served by them. However, Chen saw something that the others did not. Their handlers never addressed them by name or looked them in the eyes. They were already being trained to vanish. These kids would learn that their bodies and even their minds were no longer theirs once they were inside those castle gates. The most basic word in any language was the first one they took from her. I, the chief matron, assembled the new girls in a room within a window on Chun's first morning in the Forbidden City. Decades of palace service were evident in the woman's face, which was as pale as paper. Her eyes were unfocused, and her movements were so deliberate they appeared practiced. Her voice was a whisper that somehow reverberated throughout the room. You have no self as of right now. The word I is prohibited. The term me is prohibited. There is no such word as mine. Rather, they acquired substitute expressions. This undeserving slave cries out for food. This menial worker asks to be allowed to sleep. This unimportant person has tarnished herself, and is awaiting retribution. All self-references are necessary. Deterioration of oneself. Before any notion could be spoken, it had to pass through several levels of surrender. When a girl slips, the trainers put bamboo switches on her. Lightning-fast blows to the throat when someone unintentionally says, I want or I think. By the end of the first week, Chen could hear the girl next to her whimpering in her sleep, even though she was unconscious, as she practiced the sentences. This worthless body, this worthless body, this worthless body. Stealing their words was only the first step, I guess. They were not allowed to own property. The palace even owns the garments on their backs. They were unable to control time. Every second was planned, watched over, and managed. They were unable to possess space. The designated sleeping quarters were subject to sudden changes. Even their memories were not theirs. Girls were made to recite revised versions of their pasts during training, in which their families had kindly offered them a position in the palace. The psychological damage was more extensive. Trap questions would be asked by trainers. How does this slave feel about breakfast? Any response that started with an opinion or thought was penalized. Deflection was always the right answer. This worthless one ate what the palace kindly supplied. They would even police their dreams. Girls who spoke while they were asleep were questioned about what images had kept them awake. As mental revolt, dreams of independence, family, or home were categorized. Before going to bed, Chen learnt to clear her head and focus only on black silk. She saw other females crumble under the strain. I was unintentionally used by a girl named Lin one morning when she was requesting water. It was the penalty for unintentionally declaring, I would haunt survivors for decades. The public humiliation is just as bad as the 100 hits with split bamboo. As other trainees took turns criticizing Lin's selfishness, she was made to kneel in the courtyard. Every girl was required to either offer an insult or risk penalty. This system has been refined over generations by the matrons. They realized that when mental chains were correctly fashioned, physical ones were not necessary. Most females were no longer able to think in the first person at the end of 3 months. They had switched to the necessary third-person deprecation in their inner monologues. It occurred to Chen that this slave is hungry. Some of the girls found creative resistance in place of hunger as their own sense. In the dark, they would touch their faces in an attempt to recall how I felt. When no one was looking, they would trace their names in the dust. These minor uprisings, however, were quite dangerous. There were informants all over the palace, girls who had been so thoroughly damaged that they found meaning in reporting others. After 6 months, the last test was administered. Before a group of senior matrons, each girl was introduced individually. A straightforward inquiry was posed to them. Who are you? Silence was the right response. Those who said anything at all, including the acceptable self-deprecations, had failed. They were nevertheless enough convinced of their existence to reject it. Only those who had fully digested their non-existence and replied with flawless emptiness were permitted to move on to palace duty. Chen walked by, completely unaware that she had ever been questioned. Even direct questioning was unable to uncover her sense of self because it had been so completely obliterated. How could they withstand the whole choreography of their capitulation that followed if they couldn't even consider themselves human? Because turning her back on royalty meant death. She had been going backwards for 3 hours, her neck twitching, dishes perched on quivering arms. It was a strict rule. No one of Imperial blood could ever see her again, not even a palace maid, not even the youngest prince, who was still crawling on silk pillows, nor the emperor or his wives. This required creating a completely new method of space travel, the submissive dance that deformed bodies into irreversible harm. During her first week of full service, Chen learnt the fundamental roles. When passing royalty in hallways, they shuffle sideways, slamming into walls till paint flakes from their clothing. When exiting any room where there is an Imperial presence, the rearward walk counts steps to avoid collisions while balancing whatever they are carrying. The disorienting technique of the spiral spin when changing direction kept faces always pointed in the direction of their superiors. However, the physical requirements extended beyond mere placement, offered food while keeping their twisted positions. Imagine it walking backwards across polished floors while holding soupanes full of boiling liquid, its arms outstretched to keep the vessel as far away from royal people as possible, and its neck craned to keep an eye out for obstacles. The culinary crew kept track of mishaps. A maid fell while backing away from the Empress in the summer of 1413, spilling scorching oil on a gathering of attendants, killing 12 ladies in one morning. They were most easily broken by sleeping positions. Maids who worked in the inner palace were required to keep readiness positions even in their quarters. They had to lie on their sides, facing the door, knees bent, prepared to jump back if called upon. Even when they slept, they were unable to really rest. During midnight inspections, senior maids would whip anyone discovered spread in their natural sleeping postures or facing the incorrect way. Within months, Chun's body started to exhibit signs of deterioration. The persistent backwards tilt caused her spine to permanently bend. Days passed while her neck muscles clenched in spasms. Chronic irritation developed on the soles of her feet, which were continually sliding instead of stepping correctly. The injury to the muscles was irreversible. Older palace survivors might be recognized on the spot decades later by their characteristic slanted gait, their heads cocked as though they were still looking for imperial presence. There were modifications of the choreography for each scenario. Even when the room was empty, cleaning required a crab-like sideways crawl with shoulders always pointed toward the imperial seat. Maids moved in defensive formations, risers, and groups of 4 or 6 to create human shields at festivals when royalty might appear anywhere. This allowed at least some maids to retain proper positioning regardless of the angles at which the royals approached. Winter was a time of its own suffering. Walking was deadly and ice made backwards, but the laws remained strict. Chen observed. A girl, trip over icy stones and turn to catch herself. The procedure violation was notified right away. Wei's wrist was fractured in the fall, yet she still got 200 strikes. In any case, protocol infractions were unforgivable. Some became exceptionally adept in spatial awareness, navigating vast sections of the castle backwards without stumbling. These ladies gained value by being sent on the riskiest routes, where one mistake may result in death. However, not all accidents might be avoided by expertise alone. When they bothered to document the deaths of servants, the palace records revealed a consistent flow of fatalities due to positioning. Downstairs, women backed off balconies into wells. The physical toll was matched by the psychological toll. They were in a constant state of hypervigilance due to their constant monitoring of their bodily position in relation to invisible hazards. Maids' peripheral vision became so sharp that they could see movement behind them. However, this resulted in a lack of genuine attention on anything. Even years after leaving service, their eyes were always on the go, measuring distances, calculating escape routes, and checking angles to keep their faces correctly positioned. These movements were sustained by survivors. After 20 years out of the palace, Jen encountered a woman who still slept in the ready position, backed out of rooms, and experienced phantom pain in her neck from checking for royalty, who no longer gave her orders. The mind attempted to forget, but the body remembered. However, the physical acrobatics paled in comparison to the demands placed on women in the emperor's bed. There, the choreography of submission would entail suppressing all of their bodies, natural reactions in addition to regulating their motions. The doctor gave clear instructions. Suppress all muscle response, breathe shallowly, have glazed eyes, and turn into a warm corpse. Selected maids were subjected to demands in the inner chambers of the Forbidden City that went beyond simple physical obedience. Even when they were being used, they had to learn to be not high-ranking princes, and the emperor needed women who could perform bodily functions without displaying any signs of life, involvement, or sense of experience. Breathing exercises kicked off the training. The sound of natural breath was too loud and too lively. For hours, trainees practiced silently drawing air through barely opened lips, while maintaining a rigid chest and stifling any rib movement. They rehearsed till an arm's length away. Sensors were unable to detect respiration. During service, any woman whose breathing could be heard was punished right away. M&O for supposing to be in that space, not for upsetting royal delight. Facial control came next. Expression was not allowed. Not ache, not joy, not terror, not revulsion. Trainers tested responses with unexpected stimuli. Faces are doused with ice water. Pins that are placed beneath fingernails. Under noses, decomposing. Meat is followed by sweet scents. Women were flogged until they learnt complete stillness if they flinched, grimaced, or reacted in any way. The objective was a face so lifeless that it looked like a porcelain mask. The eyes were very difficult. They were unable to shut them. That implied resistance or concealment. They were unable to concentrate. That suggested consciousness or thought. A particular type of blindness with wide eyes, dilated pupils that did not track, and the inability to see or miss anything was the necessary condition. The repercussions for women who did not control their natural reactions were worse than death. To create the false, empty sight, some were blinded by hot needles. Others received drugs that rendered them permanently subconscious, controlling. Body temperature came next. In reaction to touch, fright, or arousal, human skin naturally flushes or cools. Through meditation practices that resembled self-hypnosis, palace women learned to inhibit these reactions. After sitting in ice baths to keep their skin warm, they would move to steam rooms to keep their skin cold. 1 in 10 people died from shock, hypothermia, or heat stroke during the training procedure itself. However, sustaining this living death while performing genuine service was the final test. Chen noticed a certain emptiness in the features of the chosen women as they emerged from the emperor's quarters, which went beyond training. They had learnt to float somewhere outside of themselves while their flesh did its job, to fully divorce consciousness from body. Some never came back to their bodies in full. For individuals who were unable to attain this state naturally, the matrons provided medicinal assistance. Dissociation was produced by combining wine with lotus powder. A numbing sensation is extracted by poppies. However, there were hazards associated with these. Too much, causing ladies to truly lose consciousness, which was prohibited. Precise dosage was required to produce self-numbness while preserving technical awareness. Chen discovered that the consequences were frequently worse than the initial conduct. Women who had managed to remain still during worship would subsequently pass out in their quarters, their bodies trembling violently as repressed emotions struggled to come to the surface. Some screamed for hours without making a sound, their lips wide. I'm still hesitant to interrupt the silent training. The necessary muscle control caused some to suffer lifelong tremors. The doctors in charge of this system took thorough notes, viewing it as scientific research rather than cruelty. They recorded the best times to breathe, how to relax your muscles, and how to quiet your mind through meditation. Their clinical tone reduced women to biological machinery designed to work in a non-responsive manner, further solidifying the terror. A complete mental fracture allowed some ladies to flee. In fact, they permanently cleared their brains to reach the necessary nothingness. These women kept on serving, breathing, and going about their daily lives in the palace, but something necessary had vanished. They were referred to by other maids as the gone ones, bodies that moved and operated but no longer held a human. Careful compartmentalization allowed the few who remained sane to do so. They made interior areas where a piece of themselves might hide and only come out in complete seclusion. However, when their bodies betrayed them through the one function, they couldn't control their monthly cycles. It proved impossible to maintain corpse-like stillness. Because a woman's biology was used as a weapon in the Forbidden City, Mina, and if she missed even one monthly cycle, she may be executed. She used concealed marks etched into jade to tally the days, 28, 29, 30, and her fear increased with every hour that went by. Menstruation was a sign of observation in the Forbidden City. The Ministry of Internal Affairs required all palace maids to report their cycles, noting start and end dates, flow intensity, and any anomalies. 50 bamboo strikes resulted from failing to report. However, since a missed cycle could signal pregnancy and unapproved pregnancy was treason against the imperial bloodline, reporting incorrectly could result in death. Women were forced to choose between conflicting impossibilities by the system. If you report too early, you risk being reprimanded for wasting ministerial time with a false alarm. If you report too late, you could be executed for hiding possible palace purity contamination. Hours, not days, were used to measure the error margin. Chen observed that women will make counting marks on any available surface. When all else failed, they used their own skin, wooden bed frames, and jade jewelry. The physical examinations were deteriorating to an unimaginable degree. Women who complained of irregularities would be examined by the male palace physicians. These examinations, which were a combination of medical treatment and public humiliation, took place in open courtyards where other servants were compelled to observe. The doctors checked for pregnancy symptoms with metal tools, their clinical effectiveness and frigid tools, completing the transgression. The waiting, however, was the true torment. A woman would experience increasing worry if her period was even 1 day late. She was unable to eat. Nausea would be interpreted as a sign of pregnancy. She was unable to sleep. Exhaustion indicated changes in the body. She was unable to work effectively. Guilt was inferred by distraction. Fear itself became proof of guilt as the palace matrons kept an eye out for these indicators. The fate of Li, a kitchen maid with an erratic cycle, was witnessed by Chen. She was hauled before the ministry after it vanished for 40 days. She protested that she had never been close to a man, but it was ignored. Being incorrect resulted in 100 bamboo strokes spread over 3 days. Enough to do lasting harm, but not enough to kill. Li lost the ability to walk without a cane, but he survived the beating. The worst part was that, in a palace setting, many women's cycles automatically ceased. Menstruation may be suppressed for months by stress, malnutrition, and ongoing physical demands. However, natural factors were not taken into account by the system. Regardless of whether it was possible or not, a halted cycle indicated a suspected pregnancy. That month, 3 women lost their lives to worry alone, their bodies shutting down under the pressure of impending retribution. Some ladies made an effort to maintain regular periods. To produce blood on time, they would ingest harmful herbs, introduce strange objects, and even hurt themselves. These last-ditch actions frequently resulted in infections that palace doctors refused to treat. Another way to resist against imperial property was to hurt oneself. The recording was intrusive and painstaking. A vast database of female biology was produced by recording each woman's cycle on wooden tablets. Analysis was done on patterns, anomalies examined, relationships between women with synchronized cycles established. Synchronous menstruation, according to the government, was a sign of either covert meetings or strong emotional attachments between maids, both of which were prohibited. The scrutiny was more intense for women serving in the inner palace. Theoretically, they could run across male royalty and become pregnant. These ladies were subjected to cycle monitoring and monthly virginity tests. Elderly matrons who had internalized the system's brutality conducted the examinations. Their harsh treatment is intended to both punish and inspect. Even bogus charges were part of the psychological warfare. A woman would occasionally be forced to prove her innocence through physical examination. When a matron claimed she had missed her report when in fact she had not, women's cycles were frequently disturbed by the fear of these unfounded accusations, resulting in the very irregularity they were alleged to be concealing. Chen became adept at spotting the telltale symptoms of a lady on the verge of cycle panic, such as obsessive counting, hidden marks, and the particular tension that increased with each day that went by without any blood. She witnessed ladies rejoice when excruciating cramps appeared, as if they were a respite from execution. Knowing that they had made it through another month, she witnessed others pass out at the first hint of red. However, the true misery was only getting started for those who were confirmed pregnant. Everything else seemed forgiving in comparison to the palace's specific regulations for ladies carrying unapproved life. As the imperial baby sucked at her breast, the wet nurse heard the cries of her own infant reverberating from the servants' quarters. Her abusers are now being fed milk that was intended for her child. For every imperial infant, the Forbidden City needed 40 wet nurses. Not as a rotation or backup. All 40 served concurrently, establishing an industrial milk production system that destroyed ordinary families and gave priority to royal infants. These women, who were chosen from among lower-class mums from nearby regions and royal servants who had gotten pregnant, experienced a particular hell created around their biology. The selection procedure started as soon as the baby was born. Inspectors showed up at homes and hospitals to check the quantity, quality, and health indicators of the new mum's milk. Within a few days after giving delivery, women who passed the initial screening were taken. Their own babies departed with family members or wet nurses who were unable to satisfy imperial requirements. The irony was scathing. It was forbidden for mothers who were considered capable of caring for royal children to feed their own. Wet nurses resided in designated areas close to the royal nurseries within the palace. They reported for feeding duty every 3 hours, day or night. Royal babies were handed amongst 10 ladies at a time as they lined up. To guarantee the best possible nourishment, every baby samples from several sources, Supervisors kept an eye on the milk flow and feeding efficiency while the ladies stood in rows like cattle, exposed from the waist up. Chen saw the systematic dehumanization while working as a rotation in the nursery wings. Numbers, not names, were used to identify wet nurses. They had to follow a very tight diet. Grells and certain soups are made to produce the most milk possible. Strong emotions that could sour the milk were prohibited for them. They were punished for crying for their own children. It was rebellion to show any preference for feeding patterns. The mortality rate for the wet nurse's own infants was 60%. These babies, who were denied their mother's milk and were given rice water and flimsy alternatives by overburdened family members, perished at rates that, in any other situation, would be considered genocide. However, official records didn't even mention their deaths. Furthermore, royal babies were not worthy of being noted in palace documents. The theft of milk was more than just nutrition. Physicians in the palace had beliefs regarding the transference of essence. Sir thought that milk could impart good traits to royal babies. This meant that wet nurses were subjected to intelligence tests, personality tests, and even assessments of their appearance. Women who were seen to possess negative qualities were banished, and their milk was regarded as tainted. The nurses were constantly anxious since the selection criteria were subject to imperial whims. There were occasions when physical changes were necessary. Painful stretching operations were performed on nurses who had inverted nipples. Hormone therapy made from animal glands were administered to those whose milk flow was judged inadequate. Grief over their own children caused some women's milk to dry up, which prompted harsh force-feeding practices intended to restore production. The palace viewed their bodies as machines and made the necessary adjustments to keep them producing. The mental torment was carefully planned. In the servants' quarters, wet nurses occasionally heard their own babies wailing. They were too far away to react, yet close enough to identify the sound. In order to provide mothers with a peek of their children while they fed imperial progeny, guards were ordered to transport sobbing infants past the nursery windows. Some mums went all out, trying to sneak their own infants into feeding schedules. Both mother and kid were executed as a result of these attempts. The economics were astounding. Over the course of their employment, each wet nurse delivered over 20,000 feedings, which equated to hundreds of gallons of milk. Each royal infant is multiplied by 40 nurses. The scale becomes evident when you include the dozen or more imperial youngsters that are there at any given moment. To maintain the imperial line, thousands of women's bodies were turned into milk production facilities, and their own children were slaughtered. However, the theft of milk was only a component of a bigger economic system. Beyond nursing, the palace forced these ladies to work for years without compensation. They worked as general maids, cleaners, and seamstresses in between feedings. All they got in return was the promise that their surviving children might be hired by the palace when they grew up, the thin soup, and sharing quarters. Some nurses tried using infection as a form of resistance. In an attempt to make their milk taste bad, they would consume prohibited foods. To get out of feeding duty, they would pretend to be ill. However, there were safeguards against everything in the palace. Force-feeding of permitted diets resulted from food contamination. Invasive examinations and punishment for attempting to disrupt imperial nourishment were the results of illness. The wet nurses who made it through their terms were damaged in particular ways. After seeing only the royal newborns they had been compelled to prioritize, many couldn't bear to look at their own kids. Others, whose bodies were conditioned to overproduce, spilled milk obsessively for years following duty. The fortunate ones were those who experienced complete amnesia about their palace years due to chi trauma, and the ladies who oversaw this extraction had also been damaged by the same system, resulting in a cycle of victims becoming victimizers. Aunt Chen held the bamboo rod above the sobbing girl, and it trembled in her fingers. Uma had been battered here 20 years prior, and now she had to turn into the monster in order to survive. They were dubbed ants by the palace. The same brutalities that they had formerly experienced were enforced by older maids who had survived decades of service. This was deliberate psychology rather than a natural process. The Forbidden City realized that the most successful torturers were those who could precisely calibrate suffering, remembered their own screams, and knew the exact amount of anguish each punishment inflicted. Aunt Chen, now 43, had first entered the castle when she was 13, with the same icy efficiency that had been used against her. She now oversaw a group of junior maids. She was aware of which blows would result in lasting scarring and which would only cause temporary welts. She knew how long a girl could kneel on shattered china before getting sick. She had been through every punishment she presently inflicted, so she knew what she was doing. It took time for the change to occur. Young maids who demonstrated extraordinary obedience were progressively given small tasks, such as allocating sleeping positions, distributing meal portions, and reporting violations. Every tiny power had unachievable options. Share a friend's punishment or point out her error. If you hit another girl, you'll get 2 strikes. Survival under the palace system required complicity. Chen observed the shaky girl in front of her as a younger version of herself. She had the same age, the same country accent, and the same tears, but she couldn't afford empathy. Because they knew the alternative, the most compassionate women frequently turned into the harshest enforcers, be lenient or risk being accused of corruption, exhibit insufficient zeal, and forfeit the perks that allowed them to survive. The calculus of oppression was straightforward. Perhaps someone would endure more suffering than you. The ants' distinctive cruelties were a reflection of their personal traumas. Particularly resentful were those who had been starved. After experiencing sexual abuse, women became ruthless when it came to virginity checks. Pregnancy guidelines were enforced with heartbreaking thoroughness by maids who had lost children. Each generation trained the next in precise violence as they repeatedly reenacted their own misery. One aunt, whose reputation caused junior maids to faint at her approach, killed 30 girls in a single year. But experience was what made her efficient. She had precisely determined the amount of power that would result in capitulation without producing martyrs when the D occurred. Administrative trouble resulted from the need to replace the dead girls. Broken girls were still able to work, and others were reminded to comply by their obvious agony. There was more to the psychological manipulation than just outright brutality. In order to foster a desperate bond, aunts would select favorites among the new girls. They would then abruptly stop showing affection, leaving girls desperately attempting to win back their approval. No beating worked as well as this emotional whiplash, because they were always trying to appease their tormentors. It made girls complicit in their own degrading behavior. Some aunts used distorted reasoning to defend their behavior. They asserted that rigorous training equipped girls for life in the palace. Learning from someone who has survived is preferable to discovering boundaries through deadly mistake. They were able to sleep at night thanks to this justification, which turned cruelty into compassion and suffering into education. While hitting girls, they would recite lines they had heard via their own screams, such as, "This hurts me more than you," or "Someday you'll thank me." Effective aunts were rewarded by the palace with a few extras such as private sleeping quarters, nicer food, and the ability to occasionally communicate with relatives who lived outside the palace. After decades of deprivation, these perks appeared to be immense. However, they had newt-like strings that tightened. Any aunt who was overly forgiving lost everything. The system made sure that showing kindness meant going back to the bottom of the ladder that they had climbed for their entire lives. Chen found that feeling relief at other people's pain was more horrifying than become harsh. She wasn't disciplined when the younger maids were. The arrival of new girls meant new targets for Imperial wrath. She found herself figuring out which girls would break the fastest and spotting flaws that may draw attention away from her own part. It was necessary to succeed in oppression rather than merely engage in it in order to survive. In addition to the systematic breakdown of female ties, individual brutality is also a problem. By making women complicit in one another's demise, the palace had perfected a demonic technique that turned friendship into a tool of control. When anyone may be today's spy or tomorrow's enforcer, natural solidarity was rendered impossible. The system's final triumph was symbolized by the ants. They demonstrated how enough pressure could turn any victim into a monster, how survival instincts could triumph over morality, and how women could be coerced into destroying one another more effectively than any outside oppressor. They served as living evidence that the palace's real genius was in corrupting souls rather than shattering bodies. Something inside her tore loose when the wooden rod hit her abdomen for the 40th time. The punishment in the palace had started, a euphemism for systematic internal mutilation intended to decrease reproductive potential while maintaining women's ability to work. They dubbed it discipline through adjustment. Female palace employees had numerous cruel interventions that accrued harm over years of employment, in contrast to male eunuchs who only had one surgical treatment. Force feeding was the first step. Wine containing potent drugs, lotus extract, poppy tears, and dissociative botanicals were administered to women who were due for adjustment. The dosage was precisely adjusted so that it prevented complete resistance, but did not totally mask discomfort. The palace wanted women to be able to recall their punishment but still being unable to effectively fight for it. The positioning followed next. Women were shackled to prevent protective motions and stretched between wooden frames, arms and legs. Younger enforcers, who were frequently recently adjusted women themselves, performed the beating under the supervision of senior matrons. The main instrument was a circular wooden rod that had been polished smooth over many generations of use and was as thick as a man's wrist. The method needed specialized instruction. If you strike too high, you risk breaking ribs and killing vital employees. If you strike too low, the damage might not be enough. The lower belly, where the reproductive organs were nestled without bone protection, was the exact target area. For first offenses, the requirement was 40 strikes, until the women died or reached the required level of sterility. The severity of the punishments increased by 20s. In her third year of service, Chen saw her first adjustment. Ming, a kitchen worker who had been caught messaging her local relatives, was the victim. She received a reproductive corrective sentence as a result of her conflicted loyalty. For decades, Chen was plagued by the sound. The sound of the wet thudding of wood against flesh was as rhythmic as drum beats, but the screams were muffled by the leather strips. The healing phase followed the beating. To extract corruption, salt and plant ash was pressed against the abdomen. The concoction allegedly prevented infection while causing more suffering by burning like acid. Matrons kept an eye out for any indications of internal bleeding while women lay in isolation cells for days, their bodies rigid with anguish. Only 3 out of 10 people made it through the operation unscathed. The palace officials had planned for the internal injuries. Scarring from severe contusion of the reproductive organs frequently obstructed the fallopian tubes. Frequent trauma may result in partial uterine detachment, which would eliminate the chance of conception and create persistent agony. Prolapse, or the persistent relocation of organs, was experienced by some women. These results were recorded by the palace doctors, who noted that rebellious tendencies had been successfully corrected. Those who survived had to deal with chronic pain and infection, which slowed their demise. Although the plant ash treatment prevented some infections right away, it also caused other problems. In reaction to trauma, women developed adhesions, which are internal tissues that fuse together. Organ relocation weakened digestive systems. Nerve injury caused many to lose bladder control, which made their suffering even more embarrassing. However, other women made a worse decision. Instead of waiting for punishment from the palace, they made their own adjustments with whatever tools they could find: sharpened bamboo, shattered ceramics, and kitchen knives. They frequently committed acts of self-mutilation that were more severe than official sentences out of desperation. The way the palace reacted to these actions was instructive. Even after surviving self-correction, women who tried to manage their own correction were beaten by the authorities. The physical anguish was matched by the psychological fallout. Even when female friends offered consolation, women who had undergone adjustment frequently couldn't tolerate being touched. They acquired particular fears. Unable to view wooden items, the scent of ash will make you panic, flinching uncontrollably when counting rhythms are played. Others withdrew into utter quiet, their thoughts running away from tortured bodies. The effectiveness of the system was horrifying. The palace made sure that women lived in continual fear of the next level by instituting tiered punishments. Those first-time offenders who made it through their 40 strikes understood that any further offense would result in 60. Self-policing is more effective than any guard system because of this understanding. Instead of taking the chance of moving on to the next level of punishment, women would betray friends. Successful results were described in medical records from the era, which were written in clinical terminology that heightened the horror. Permanently sterilized, women were nevertheless able to perform manual labor. With approbation, the doctors saw that women who had adjusted frequently put in more effort than they had previously. They had turned reproductive assault into a management tactic because they were afraid of getting more corrections. When confronted with such cruelty, a group of palace ladies made the unimaginable decision: ultimate self. They would kill the emperor who was the cause of their misery, in the most desperate murder attempt in history. 16 ladies slithered through moonlit hallways while holding curtain cords and silk ribbons, their homemade weapons. October of 1542, Emperor Jaring reclined in drugged slumber, tired from yet another night of alchemical experiments and sexual excess, while the forbidden city slept under the October fog. Throughout months of planning, the conspirators concealed firearms in plain sight as ornamental items and communicated through gestures during group punishments. Consort Duan, their leader, had witnessed her sister being raped and beaten to death because she had cried. They would put an end to the cause of all palace misery tonight. Because complexity meant discovery, the plan was straightforward. During the darkest hours of slumber, 16 palace women who had access to the emperor's bedchamber would sneak inside, use curtain ropes and silk scarves, the only weapons they could get without being discovered. Before guards could react, they would choke him, swift, quiet, and definitive. The hair ribbons and discarded needlework supplies that were lying around the palace will be used as tools of imperial demise. Their footsteps were silent on stones they knew by touch as they traveled through passageways they had polished for years, like ghosts. Every woman has a personal trauma. 3 adjustments had been made to Yang. Due to wet nursing, Wang has lost 2 infants. Lady Kui had scars from torture experiments. Their various hardships came together to form a common goal. The emperor needs to perish. 3 guard posts had to be crossed to get to the bedchamber. However, palace security ignored the shattered women who changed silk sheets and emptied chamber pots in favor of concentrating on outside threats. For weeks, the conspirators had rehearsed their strategy, learning which floor stones cracked, and scheduling guard rotations. They crawled beneath sightlines to get past the first checkpoint. The second is by coordinating their movements with the tea breaks of the guards. With the guards gambling in a side room, certain that no danger could come from within, the third stood empty. Emperor Jia Jing was lying in the chamber, stretched out on his bed, his mouth wide open, his entire body exposed. This time, the women had practiced with wrapped blankets for practice dummies. To avoid conflict, Consort Duan would wrap the fabric around his neck while others held his limbs. The knot, a sliding noose that would tighten with opposition, had been practiced hundreds of times. But everything went wrong in the dark, with hands trembling and pulses pounding. Thousands of women would have been spared if the knot had slipped. Trembling fingers tied a fixed loop that was impossible to tighten rather than a slipping noose. The emperor felt a silk brush his throat. He shifted. Coordination was ruined by panic. While some women hesitated, others pulled. The bed curtains tangled with the silk cord. A porcelain vase was knocked over by someone. Judging was awakened by the crash. He clutched at the slack silk about his neck, shouted, and flailed. Guards arrived in a matter of seconds for the conspirators. Some of them ran away right away. Others tugged ropes in various directions in a desperate attempt to finish their mission. The assassination descended into pandemonium due to their lack of practice with violence. Yang struggled to straighten the knot while Lady Wang tried to choke him with cushions. Their fate was determined by their clumsy desperation. When the guards arrived, they saw the emperor breathing and with a purple face, surrounded by women, who were crying and still holding their pitiful weapons. Less than 3 minutes had passed since the insurrection began. Their family were unaware that they and the conspirators had just received death sentences. Individual punishment was not the extent of palace justice. Generational erasure was necessary for treason. Without determining culpability, the interrogations started right away. In order to expose the entire network, the women had been captured red-handed throughout the night. Torture specialists broke fingers, burned flesh, and extracted names. But the conspirators had been astute in their hiring practices. Only ladies who had already been ruined by palace life had been engaged. They had nothing left to lose. Hope itself had been destroyed so completely that the circle remained small. The people witnessed the executions. Slow slicing in the palace. Courtyard killed all 16 women. 3 days are needed to finish the process. However, they first witnessed the same destiny before their families. Condemned by association include mothers, sisters, children, and even newborn nieces. It was an obvious message. Entire bloodlines would be destroyed if they rebelled against the emperor. The retaliation would make earlier penalties appear lenient. Every woman in the palace was scrutinized more closely. Group meetings were prohibited. No cloth longer than a handspan could be owned by women. It even grew suspicious to glance at curtain cords. The palace had used the failed assassination as justification to enact regulations they had always wanted but had been unable to defend. Jing himself developed uncontrollable paranoia. He required male eunuchs to taste test everything he ate, rearranged his bedchambers every night, and had no faith in female attendants. For those who remained, the women's desperate attempt to put an end to their misery had only made things worse. Back to that blood-soaked morning in 1421. The failed assassination set off a fresh surge of violence that would result in the mass murder of 2,800 women. Lady Kui, determined to document what the palace historians were already starting to erase, dipped her brush in ink laced with her own blood. April 22, 1421. Imperial historians convened in the palace archives while bodies remained chilled on the execution grounds. Their mission was to eradicate, not to downplay or reinterpret any trace of the slaughter that had taken place the day before. As completely as their bodies would disappear into mass graves, 2,800 women would be erased from history. The emperor had ruled that the incident would never take place. Furthermore, the emperor's word had the power to alter reality in Imperial China. Erasure's mechanics were systematic. Destroy primary records first. Every palace employee's name, age, village of origin, and dates of employment were recorded in meticulous logs kept by the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Special furnaces were used to burn these manuscripts so that no legible ash was left behind. Next, get rid of secondary references. Any documentation that may suggest 2,800 people had previously lived there, such as payment records, food allocation, lists, dormitory assignments, or ATAs, had to be destroyed or altered. However, the erasure had been foreseen by Lady Kui, a prominent royal administrator who had access to these documents. She had begun her own documentation days prior to the slaughter, when orders for execution started to circulate. She documented names, ages, and tales using conventional materials like poetry, paper, and painting silk that would appear commonplace if found. She created permanent evidence in the fluid of life itself by combining her own blood with soot. When conventional ink ran out, it was a difficult task for the official historians. There would be strange gaps if documents were just destroyed. They had to come up with other stories instead. The 2,800 women who were put to death were either married off to their families or moved to provincial palaces. To prevent trends, death dates were dispersed throughout several decades. With landscaping work explaining the freshly disturbed ground, the mass grave site was transformed into a meditation garden. If not their records, the imperial historians left 2,800 gaps in their minds. They trained themselves to be selectively blind, unable to recognize differences. They documented efficiency gains when food allocations decreased by thousands of portions overnight. They saw renovations underway when a whole wing of servant quarters was vacant. There was more to their collusion than lying. In order to comply with imperial orders, they reorganized their own vision. However, Lady Kui concealed her story when no one dared to peek under the ornate scrolls of her own burial arrangements. Elderly royal attendants were expected to prepare their own burial goods in accordance with traditional Chinese culture. In reality, her dying poems were testimony from victims. Coded dates and names appeared in her afterlife paintings. She bet that her documents would be shielded from casual scrutiny by cultural taboos around death materials. Erasure was not limited to paperwork. Elimination of physical evidence was also necessary. 2,800 women's personal items, including clothing, jewelry, and letters from their homes, were gathered and set on fire. The actual execution site underwent renovations. Soil was removed to a depth of 6 feet, and stones were reinstalled. In order to cover the land that had drank so much blood, cherry trees were planted in tidy rows. However, some evidence was irreparable. Other women from the palace recalled. They kept mental records of the erased, informed new arrivals about the lost, and whispered names in the dark. It is possible that the actual number of victims was even greater. According to some estimates, hundreds more people perished in the days that followed as a result of suicide motivated by survivor guilt or injuries received while being made to witness the killings. Any written documentation of these memories was thwarted by the imperial censors. Beyond the rudimentary characters required for inventory work, palace women were prohibited from learning to write. The same modifications used to physical rebellion were applied to those who were found in possession of private writings. Constantly moving women to other sections broke apart groups that may preserve collective memory, disrupting oral histories. But Lady Kui continued, perhaps accelerated by the blood loss from her documentary work, even as her health deteriorated. In her secret archive, she trained a successor. This woman, whose name was ultimately removed as well, carried on the tradition of passing down suppressed history from generation to generation through labis-disguised melodies, needlework designs, and burial items. The erasure was almost finished in terms of effectiveness. The massacre in 1421 is not mentioned in any official Chinese history. Perfect documented silence surrounded those dates. According to Western historians who later had access to imperial archives, had it not been for Lady Kui's blood-stained evidence, which was found centuries later concealed within the ornamental scrolls of a tomb, The murder of 2,800 women would have accomplished its goal. 2,000 flawless historical non-existence points were awarded to me. And now, after centuries of systematic brutality, we went back to that April morning when 2,800 women discovered that the reputation of one man was more valuable than their lives. On April 21st, 1421, the sun rose, revealing a scene of deliberate destruction. Despite the fear, 2,800 palace ladies knelt in perfect rows in the greatest courtyard of the Forbidden City, keeping their backs straight and adhering to the posture, discipline that had been instilled in them even as they faced death. In reaction to a single rumor, that his favorite concubine's suicide was caused by his sexual inadequacy rather than her alleged guilt over imaginary crimes, Emperor Yanga had ordered their execution. Mass murder mechanisms needed to be organized. The ladies were separated into groups of 50 by the guards, and each group was given a team of executioners who were experts in linki or death by 1,000 cuts. However, this would not be the extended artistic expression that is reserved for exceptional criminals. Efficiency was required due to time constraints. Less but deeper incisions would be made, with the goal of killing in a matter of hours as opposed to days. Still, the math of misery becomes astounding when you multiply hours by 2,800. Waves of sound accumulated. Initially there was the sound of sharpening blades, followed by metallic melodies that blended into a menacing melody. Then there were footsteps as the executioners positioned themselves, the leather boots stomping on overnight fallen cherry blossoms, the petals blending with the soon-to-be flowing blood. In a voice that reverberated throughout the courtyard, the chief executioner read accusations: collaborative treachery against the Dragon Throne, corruption of imperial dignity, and conspiracy to propagate defamatory tales. The stifling silence of palace training eventually broke as blades went to work. Screams broke out, expressing pure suffering rather than pity, which training had eradicated. The names of children they would never see again were yelled out by several women. Some people performed snippets of Buddhist prayers. Many died as silently as they had lived, their voices silenced by years of imposed silence. By noon, blood had covered the courtyard stones, making them undetectable. The sheer volume of executions left the executioners weary, and they worked in shifts. They dragged bodies to the expanding piles at the boundaries of the courtyard, accumulating mountains of flesh that would take days to burn. The irony of blood mingling with incense filled the air. To cover up the death, jasmine, and stench, the palace burned, producing a perfume that would linger in the memories of survivors. At the height of the carnage, Emperor Yongle himself emerged, transported in a sedan chair to watch his orders being carried out. He merely lingered for a few minutes, confirming the veracity of the massacre before withdrawing to his quarters. He reportedly spent that night with fresh concubines, demonstrating his virility to himself as thousands perished for challenging it, according to historical records. After sunset, the murders went on. The final executions were illuminated by torches creating dancing shadows that added to the ghoulish atmosphere. According to reports, the youngest woman to pass away was a girl who had only been in palace service for a few weeks. She died pleading for a mother she would never see again after becoming entangled in the web of collective retribution. Her voice was as faint as thread before it was permanently hushed by the blades. The cover-up started in a matter of hours. To avoid any memorialization, bodies were burned in mass funerals outside the city, and the ashes were dumped into the river. The courtyard was completely refurbished. Every stone was swapped out, and all blood traces were removed. Strategically placed in rows, cherry trees drank deeply from soil that had been supplemented with human remains. Physical proof of the massacre had disappeared by the next morning. However, the erasure was more profound. These women had never existed. According to retroactively amended palace documents, various lies were told to their relatives. Daughters had chosen religious retirement, been moved to far-off districts, or died of unexpected sickness. Implied threats were used to quiet the few who pushed for the truth. With bureaucratic efficiency, a whole generation of women was erased from history, setting the stage for more genocides. Today, the same courtyard now renowned for its cherry blossoms is traversed by tour guides. They talk about architectural wonders, cultural treasures, and imperial splendor. Where 2,800 women perished is not marked with plaques. They're obliterated. Existence is not commemorated by any memorials. The official histories of the Palace Museum uphold the 600-year quiet. There is no record of the largest mass killing of women in Chinese history. In death, its victims are as invisible. as they were compelled to be during their lifetime. This is the result of systematic dehumanization, a world in which 2,800 people can be killed, and so thoroughly obliterated that it looks like historical fiction to doubt their existence. There are no autobiographies, pictures, or tombs left by the female eunuchs of China's imperial palace. These days, their only remnants are the genetic memory of generational tragedy and blood-written testimony concealed in funeral scrolls. Their tale serves as a reminder that those in charge of deciding whose victims are permitted to live on in memory at all times write history, not just the winners.